It was their responsibility, their moral responsibility to look good. But then equally, they had to be virtuous. It would have been very difficult, particularly when women were in danger of being regarded as prostitutes, even if they lifted up their skirts to go over a muddy puddle in the road and showed their ankles. It was very difficult.
Welcome to the History Extra Podcast. Fascinating historical conversations from the makers of BBC History Magazine. From false rumps and fake teeth to toxic skincare and insect-laden hair. Over the last 400 years, British women have resorted to some extraordinary lengths in the pursuit of beauty. In her new book, Perfection, Margarette Lincoln delves into some of these past beauty practices and considers their impact on the women who engaged in them. I spoke to her to find out more. In your new book, Perfection, you look at 400 years of women's beauty regimes. What kind of practices have you uncovered?
Well, I think what people are quite familiar with is the notion that in the 18th century, people wore lead-based white makeup, which was actually poisonous. But they might not have known that in Victorian times, women were eating arsenic wafers or arsenic pills to give their skin pallor. And that later on, they were putting bear's grease on their hair and various other concoctions. So I think there's a lot in the book that's not particularly well known and will open up people's eyes to the way in which beauty and the pursuit of social acceptance has dominated women's lives for centuries.
I guess something I wanted to reiterate before we go any further and we look at some of those strange beauty regimes is why this is important, why this is a significant historical topic. What do you think that we can learn from looking at the history of women's beauty regimes?
Well, at the most basic level, I think we can learn that women are enormously creative and resilient, and that despite lots of constraints on their lives and other difficulties in getting hold of cosmetics or being allowed to wear them, they do use whatever opportunities come along. It is actually only superficially trivial. It is a very important topic. And I think in a world when there's so much casual misogyny, it's a good idea to explore it and show the ramifications of makeup and hygiene and diet and exercise.
You begin the book in the 17th century. Why do you think that that's an interesting point to start a study of beauty? What was going on at the time?
Well, of course, beauty manuals circulated earlier. But the thing about starting in the mid-17th century is that the elite were using much more makeup to the extent that it became, an important trade and became bound up with lots of other practices in politics and marriage and the position of women. So at that point, I think it is a good starting point.
I wonder if you've looked across 400 years of beauty, are there any continuities in beauty standards for women? Is there anything that we can say has always been held up as an ideal, or are these ideals ever shifting and ever changing?
Well, there are continuities. I mean, the association of makeup with prostitution, fallen women, is a strong continuity. And then even in individual practices, there are continuities. So, for example, in the 17th century, women were advised to wash their face with the water in which they'd boiled veal. And then later in Victorian times, you had women strapping slabs of veal to their cheeks overnight in bed and tying them in place with strips of linen, for a beautiful complexion. So these practices, they linger. I suppose another continuity is that whatever development in makeup or diet or exercise, very soon there would be some constraint attached to it, which would mean that women would have to get round the problem in order to continue. So, for example, when they were told to exercise more, certain people who wrote books on how to exercise with those kind of clubs that you see jugglers using, so that women did calisthenics. They also complained that when women read books or wrote letters or drew at the easel, they raised one shoulder more than the other and drew diagrams as to how women should stand, So it was incredibly constraining. It would make you very conscious of your body.
The point that you made earlier about the connections that have been drawn between makeup and prostitution are interesting because there's always this tension, right, between criticizing women for not making enough effort and criticizing women for making too much effort. Is that a universal thing that you've seen crop up again and again?
Well, we know of it in our own times because of COVID. I mean, people would criticize women for slopping around all day in their pajamas. But equally, if they put on a lot of makeup to do their office calls, they were mocked as well. I mean, it was a very tricky situation. But I think in Victorian times, it was different in that women were not supposed to wear makeup at all. I mean, Queen Victoria praised soap and water, and that's as far as it went. So women were forced to, do very strange things with the makeup that they put on so that it didn't look as if they were wearing any, tinted lip sols and tinted powders. I mean, it didn't help, of course, that a lot of the makeup they could buy was actually very toxic. I mean, they got lead poisoning and skin infections, so a lot of them were afraid to use it. One of the safest things they could use was white chalk, but as you can imagine, chalk on the face never looked very good.
Yeah, and I want to talk about some of those more dangerous practices later in this conversation, but I wonder if we could stay on that morality question a bit longer. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about how ideas of beauty have been tied into questions of morality for women, and also perhaps how that is kind of also tied in to race and class as well over those 400 years.
That's a very good question. I mean, if you simply take a look at women's silhouette, the notion that they had to wear tight stays or corsets was very strong in the 18th century. If a woman slopped around without a corset on, it was tantamount to thinking she was having an illicit affair. And so, it's very much bound up with morality and with class, because any beauty procedure takes time and money, and lower class women could not afford the kind of upmarket corsets that the elite wore. And because English women invested so much time in this kind of tight silhouette, whether or not it was dangerous, the jury's out on that. They invested so much time in wearing these corsets that in colonies in India and Africa, even though men who went out there said, "Oh, hang on a minute, these women here don't wear these corsets and aren't in the least bit crooked, whereas at home women are very strange shapes." Nevertheless, it was part of the sort of white supremacy that English women wore these corsets, even in the most ridiculous situations. In Victorian times, they even developed corsets for wear in the colonies, slightly cooler versions of corsets that they might wear at home, but they didn't leave them off.
So when often these trends were so punishing, is there any way of telling where these beauty trends emerged from and who was setting them and who polices them? Or is it much harder to pin down?
Well, if we stick with stays and corsets, I mean, it started with the elite. I mean, they wore them almost as a status symbol at court. And of course, classes that want to emulate the elite or rise up the social scale will wear them. In Victorian times, in the East End of London, there would be corset clubs so that the upper working classes could club together and afford a corset which would set them above the kind of workers who really didn't have such nice garments. So it is a class and status thing, but very closely bound up with morality.
So let's talk about body size and body shape. Even within the last 2 decades, body ideals for women have changed dramatically. And even through these different changes, they've often been unrealistic for many. Is that reflected in the history? Have body ideals always been unrealistic for a lot of people?
I think the short answer is yeah. I mean, in the 18th century, some women tried to get very tiny waists, a sort of hourglass figure. And reputedly, some managed to get down to 14 inches, which is ridiculous. But on the whole, they only reduced their waist size by about 4 inches. I mean, in museum collections, you can see these quite well-worn corsets, so they couldn't have been too uncomfortable to wear. Of course, they may have kept tighter ones for best, but by and large, they reduced their waist size by only about 4 inches. But then they developed things in the Victorian age like metal eyelet, creating corsets on the cross. The material was on the bias, so it had greater strength. And they wore steel busks. That's a kind of straight plank thing that went down the front of the corset. So, people joked that once they got these things on, they were in danger of being electrified if a lightning bolt struck them. I mean, they were quite substantial garments. So yes, it was very restrictive and very ridiculous, actually.
I think the idea of the Victorian corset is, rightly quite famous because it's so extreme. But in your book, you also look at different examples of stays and body shapes and devices, I guess, that were used for body shaping over time. I wonder if you could tell us about some that are a bit less well known as well.
Well, one of my favourites is the false rump, which was shaped like bottoms with horsehair and chopped cork, which you could go to a bum shop to buy these contraptions. And, it puffed out your bum so that your dress was more voluminous and hang nicely. And servants who couldn't afford these kinds of things would pin feather dusters to their dresses to bolt them out behind. And the other thing that was briefly a fashion was a kind of false pad in the front that women wore to appear 3 months or 6 months pregnant. I mean, you could even get full-blown pads that looked as if you were about to give birth. And then people worried that perhaps this was being used to conceal bastard pregnancies, and so the fashion died out. But I think it was really introduced so that the muslin dresses that were briefly fashionable hanged nicely.
One of the most stomach-churning chapters in your book focuses on teeth. What are some of the lengths that people have gone to get that perfect smile over the last 4 centuries?
Yes, I really enjoyed writing that chapter, yes. It was horrific in some cases. Basically, everybody had rotten teeth due to the sugar consumption, which kind of rocketed. There was very little that they could do about it. I mean, false teeth sort of were around in classical times, but there was very little that they could do in the 18th and 19th centuries. Basically, they tried things like extracting live teeth from little children because their teeth were smaller, and they picked the incisors because they have a single root. And then you would go to the dentist, have your rotten tooth extracted, and this tooth would be put in, and they would hope that it would take, which sometimes it did, but then sometimes it rose, as they said, and the body ejected it. And of course, you could pass on very serious diseases with these secondhand teeth. You could get syphilis and various other illnesses. And the other scandal, of course, is battlefield teeth. I mean, the battlefield of Waterloo and other battlefields were scavenged for teeth, which were then inserted into ivory or gold bases. And you, at least you could boil them before these false teeth were made, so there was less risk of infection. But you couldn't eat with these teeth. I mean, people would take them out before meal times, and what you would have would be a sort of artificial masticator, a bit like a pair of pliers that allowed you to crush up your food before you ate it. Because all this time, people were investigating the digestive process, to work out what foods were good for you. And they did work out that chewing your food was probably a good idea. So they discouraged women to kind of bolt their food. And this led to the practice of mothers making their daughters eat in their bedrooms before mealtimes, because eating was such a problem. But then, it gave rise to the notion that young women lived on nothing but air. So even that was problematic. One of the problems with false teeth was that women were very embarrassed about acknowledging that they had. So if they had a little plate, often they didn't take them out. They became impacted in their mouths and very foul. And of course, then when they slept, the danger was that they swallowed these things. They could become impacted in the esophagus because they were full of little gold hooks and sticky out bits, which was, it could be fatal. But if they just passed into the digestive system, one dentist was a bit flawed by this, but then he remembered owl pellets and seeing that these pellets were wrapped in the skin of the mice that it had eaten. So he fed this woman strips of wool, and sure enough, she safely passed this contraption that she'd had in her mouth. So when rubber, vulcanite false teeth came in, it was a huge advance. And in Britain, when the National Health Service started up, millions of women had all their teeth pulled out and false teeth put in.
Well, I guess I did at least warn listeners that was going to be a slightly grisly section of this. But you've led us nicely onto the idea of diet and exercise, which is something that, countless women have grappled with over time. I wonder if you could give us some historical parallels or examples of that.
Well, in the past, women, unless they were working class women who had no problem at all with diet and exercise because their food was limited and they had a lot of laborious tasks to perform. But middle and upper class women were sort of confined to the drawing room, and they did not get much exercise. And of course, corseted as they were, they had lots of digestive problems. So eventually doctors began to argue that they should take carriage rides, they should, walk more, they should exercise with these dumbbells, which men had been exercising with, since the early 18th century. So women began to take more exercise and began to go skating and dancing and fencing. And this was very attractive to them because even walking required a special walking dress. Walking dresses had a hem about 2.5 inches off the floor so that it didn't trail in the mud, And these special costumes advertised that you were a person with self-control and determination and high moral stance, and you took care of yourself. But as for dieting, well, people didn't really know about food values. I mean, in the 18th century, it was all a question of the 4 humours and keeping these 4 humours in the body in balance. And the 4 humours were blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. And everything would be fine so long as they were in balance and didn't cause an obstruction. So fasting was good. You fasted one day, perhaps, so that, if you'd eaten too much the day before, everything would continue to be in balance. But then people began to find out more about digestion, and fad foods, came in.
Has there always been on a pressure on women to be thinner? Has that got a long history?
Well, very large women have always been regarded a bit suspiciously and made fun of, partly because it was thought, they wouldn't have much success on the marriage market because they would be infertile. But I mean, if you think back to Victorian times, women were meant to be voluptuous. It must have been very hard to be around in about 1900 when you've just gone through a voluptuous period and then suddenly everybody's stick thin and you have to shed all those pounds. I mean, really serious dieting took off in the early 20th century because you had to be straight from the armpits to the hips, I mean, it must have been very tough.
It strikes me listening to all of this that all of these practices, whether it's dieting, whether it's maintaining the perfect teeth or exercise or hair, whatever it may be, required a lot of time and effort from women. What do you think that the impact of that was?
Well, I think it would obviously make you obsessively conscious of your body. Of course, a lot of women did rebel about the time it took to dress their hair and to make these creams for their face. Some didn't enjoy riding at all. I mean, all these things had to be done and were a bit of a chore. But equally, I mean, they did give women opportunities. I mean, once gymnastics came in, and the Americans are very quick to put gymnastics into women's colleges, and it was a career opportunity for them. They could teach gymnastics. The same as when hygiene improvements came into being. They suddenly found there was an opening for them, promulgating good hygienic practices. And dentistry too, they could be dentist assistants. Not least because when men started to use gas, it was very dodgy for women to be alone with the male dentist, unconscious, having been gassed. So they wanted a female assistant there.
Interesting. So it's a commercial opportunity as well.
Well, exactly. I mean, paradoxically, all these things are both a constraint and an opportunity. I mean, that's a theme that runs all the way through the book.
There are so many interesting avenues we could go down here, but I do want to bring out a couple more examples for listeners because they're extraordinary. I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about hair and hairstyling. What are some of the most demanding hairstyles that became popular?
I think in Victorian Edwardian times, you had to have big hair. And very few people have big hair, actually. So, they made do with a lot of false hair, either swatches plaited into their own hair or wigs. And of course, this became a really important trade. And one of the themes in the book is how women's beauty practices actually further trade and empire, because the import of hair, from Brittany, where women wore close white caps, and so it didn't matter if their hair was shorn, they sold it. From China, which went through Marseille, was a big thing, and hair was smuggled into New York on those liners. I mean, customs officers would watch the women struggling off the liners, and if they had difficulty walking or sitting down, they would search them. And women could be found with, pounds and pounds of hair sewed into their petticoats, ready to sell it. Because America was a big market for false hair. It was sold mail order.
There was a particularly horrifying example in your chapter on hair that really stayed with me about somebody recalling, I think it was their aunt's hair, being set for weeks and then being unpacked. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that process.
Well, in the 1770s and 1780s, very tall hair was a fashion because it allowed women to occupy space. It was a status thing. But of course, how they achieved it was to pile pads of stuffing on the head, on the crown of the head, and stick all this together with pomade. Now, the pomade often had pesticide in to kill bugs and mice who might be going up there. But well, afterwards, they would stroke and comb the hair over these vast edifices and powder it and set it and perfume it. Well, once you've gone to all this trouble, you didn't want to do it again. And a very famous hairdresser of the period thought that, about 8 to 11 weeks was as far as this could go, And women never combed it out because it's set, it would be very painful to comb it out. So they left it. I mean, there are stories of women seeing mice nibble away at women's hair in the pews, Anyway, there's this probably misogynistic tale of a young man going to visit his aunt when the hairdresser came and watching her hair being opened, inverted commas, and all these insects and lice crawling out of it. And of course, the smell, as he says, being dreadful. Probably it would have been in hot weather too.
Oh, let's move on from that. Something that I wanted to ask you about was youth. People have gone to long lengths to try and look more young. In the pre-surgery era, what were some of the ways that women tried to maintain a youthful appearance?
There were various remedies for plumping out the skin. So Elizabeth I would wear plumpers in her cheeks to disguise the fact that she'd lost a lot of teeth. And then in the 18th century, to avoid wrinkles, there were ridiculous remedies in books. You could burn myrrh on a sort of fire shovel, fill your mouth with white wine, then spit it onto this shovel and inhale the fumes underneath a kind of linen cloth. I think that would have been very dangerous. I mean, your hair could have caught on fire, anything could have happened. So basically, I think once you'd gone grey, you wore a cap. Or you could have false hair sewn round the rim of your cap so it looked as if you still had coloured hair. I mean, hair dyes were totally useless. If you were unlucky enough to be born with red hair, you could use a lead comb and it might turn brown, but probably it would turn streaky. So you wore wigs. I mean, it was quite fashionable to wear a wig in the early 1800s. And women were not abashed to do this. They might change the color of their wig several times a day. It was just accepted that hair was a problem.
We kind of touched on this earlier, but I wonder if we could return to it. This idea of women being criticised for putting too much effort into their looks and it being shallow or vain. I wonder if there are any examples of that you could share with us.
It's tricky because Victorian conduct books, whether or not women actually set much store by them, always said that women had to look good it was their responsibility, their moral responsibility to look good. But then equally, they had to be virtuous. And it would have been very difficult, particularly when, the women were in danger of being regarded as prostitutes, even if they lifted up their skirts to go over a muddy puddle in the road and showed their ankles. It was very difficult. And in fact, if men who married later in Victorian times and who resorted to brothels regularly, then there was very little means for them to recognize prostitutes from other women unless they went by makeup and perhaps bright clothes or the lack of a veil. And women were always being complaining that they'd been mistaken for prostitutes in the streets. So they were caught really between two standards. Very difficult for them, I think.
Do you think that these trends always reveal something or reflect something about the societies that they emerge in and the eras they emerge in? Or sometimes are trends just quite random?
No, I think they always do have a social context. So, the rigorous diets for women and the exercise regimes were linked to the suffrage movement. I mean, women who were demanding the vote made a point of showing that they were regimented enough to watch their weight. Because, of course, diets originally didn't come into the 1860s or so for men. And it was for men. I mean, it was a kind of rigorous procedure that men didn't think women were capable of. It required, abstinence and a strong mind to lose weight, which women were incapable of losing weight. They were expected to be round and plump and white. That was just the thing. So diets for women didn't come in until 25 years after dieting for men.
The suffrage example is an interesting one because I think we've spoken a lot about the 18th century and the 19th century, but did these more punishing beauty trends let up by the time we get to the 20th century, or do they just morph into different shapes?
I think they mostly morph. So the bathroom became a slimming aid, if you like. You could buy Clark's slimming bath salt, slimming paste for your ankles. Once weighing machines became cheap enough to buy in most houses, you were expected to weigh yourself every day. I mean, originally, of course, weighing machines could only be found at chemist shops and railway stations, and people trekked there to keep an eye on their weight. Before, they would never have thought of doing this. It's just that diet books came out with height-weight charts that had been used in the insurance industry. And this just added more pressure to women to be of a so-called normal weight, which it would never have occurred to them to be otherwise,
Yeah, it's interesting, that idea of the introduction of science and technology really into the beauty industry.
Yes, I mean, exactly. Beauty practices enabled women to experience medicine and science in a totally different way, both, science to do with diet and medical practice to do with keeping your body in good condition, taking the right amount of exercise. But a lot of this is completely racialized. And when it's taken into a colonial setting, it's just used as another way to construct whiteness and to assert white supremacy or colonial supremacy. It's quite insidious, really. But you can see that women who've been under this pressure and who've put so much time and effort into ensuring that their complexion is flawless and it reflects well on their morals, their godliness, and their ability to bring up a good family, they will try and preserve this in colonial settings. And of course, it leads to colonial hierarchies that are really pernicious.
What do you think that all of this tells us about changing ideas about women over the last 400 years?
Well, obviously, women have entered public life and political life. I mean, nowadays it's fine for our deputy prime minister to go around with red hair, which was never a good look in the past, totally out. It's not put up, which again would have been frowned upon in the past. So obviously, there are improvements. But I think women still find that they are a kind of punch ball between a diet industry that compels them to be thin and a kind of sports industry that wants them to be, muscular and fit, and a beauty industry that wants them to be flawless all the time. It is very difficult. And it is bound up with whether or not they're able to get good jobs, what they look like in the workplace, how they can dress. So I think, I started off this book thinking it would be a history of kind of different kinds of beauty practices through 400 years, and it would all be vaguely amusing, but actually it's not. It is quite tragic in many instances. And at the end of the day, you do feel an enormous amount of admiration for women who's struggled all the way through this. I mean, really, the book is about the making of the modern woman, if you like, and how they've come to resist these kinds of pressures.